Good afternoon, I'm Robert Pondiscio, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. The UK and the US may share a common language, but our education systems are very different. Thus, today's conversation, what can the US learn from England's rise in reading scores, has two major themes. What can the US learn from the UK's experience in improving reading outcomes, but also what are the limits of those lessons? In the next hour and change, we hope to unpack these themes with our guest, Nick Gibb, and I'm also delighted that Emily Hanford is with me today to interview Minister Gibb. I'll introduce them both now. Emily Hanford is a senior correspondent and producer at APM Reports and host of Sold a Story, the groundbreaking investigative podcast that is changing how kids are being taught to read here in America. Sold a Story was one of the most shared shows on Apple Podcasts in 2023, and one of Time Magazine's top podcasts of the year. It has won numerous honors, including a DuPont, an Edward R. Murrow, and a Peabody nomination. She began her career with an internship at the public radio station in her college town of Amherst, Massachusetts. She worked for Ira Glass when Ira Glass was making the pilots for This American Life. Her reporting has won many honors, including awards from the Education Writers Association and the American Educational Research Association. In a piece recently for Education Next about Emily's work with Riley Fletcher, I wrote the piece with Riley Fletcher. Riley Fletcher was not working with Emily, he was working with me. I wrote that if the measure of education journalism is its influence on classroom practice, public policy, and other journalists, Hanford's impact is unmatched. Nick Gibb was a member of Parliament for nearly 30 years in England. He's also a former schools minister, serving for over 10 years in the UK government under 4 prime ministers. As schools minister, he introduced the phonics screening check and the multiplication tables check, and he reformed the primary national curriculum, as well as introducing revised GCSE and A-level exams, ensuring the primacy of knowledge in England's schools. As education minister, Gibb overhauled the teacher training framework and professional development for teachers in the first 2 years of the profession to ensure that initial teacher training and continuing professional development was evidence-led. He also oversaw the reform of the suite of national professional qualifications for teachers, senior leaders, and head teachers. He also revised, simplified, and strengthened the teachers' standards, including an explicit requirement that primary school teachers know how to teach reading using systematic synthetic phonics. He also introduced the Mandarin Excellence Program and the Model Music Curriculum. As we will see, the UK's performance in reading is measured by both PISA and Pearls improved smartly under Gibb's tenure. A recent Daily Telegraph article described Nick Gibb as, quote, the most influential schools minister in England's history. Please welcome Emily Hanford and Nick Gibb. Now, to level set our conversation here, Minister Gibb has agreed to give a brief 7 to 10 minute presentation with a few slides, which I guess Riley Fletcher will fire for you. But Mr. Gibb, the floor is yours.
Super, thank you very much. So just to set some context, I became an MP in 1997, and the first thing you do as an MP is you visit your local schools. So I went into some of my local secondary schools, and they told me that 50% of the pupils in those schools have a reading age below their chronological age, and a quarter have a reading age at least 2 years below their chronological age. Well, I couldn't understand why this was so. My mother was a teacher, and she didn't have children in her class with a reading age below their actual age. And so I spoke to the primary schools, and I asked them how often they heard children read, and they said, once a week. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound like enough to become a proficient reader. And then I got into the whole debate about how you teach children to read. So in 2003, I joined the Education Select Committee, and I met Ruth Miskin, who in England is very well known as somebody who believes in a proper approach to teaching phonics. And she introduced me to this whole debate about whole language teaching of reading versus phonics. So whole language is you basically repeat high-frequency words over and over again, like look, John, look, Janet, look, with the hope that children will pick it up. And then the phonics approach, of course, is you learn the 44 sounds of the alphabet, and you blend how to blend those into words. Cat. So I was introduced to this whole issue. And at that time, maybe next slide, we were declining the United Kingdom in the PISA league tables. So we've gone from 7th in reading in the year 2000 to 17th by 2006, and then 25th by 2009. And I wanted to understand why. And the same thing was happening in maths, and the same thing was happening in science. So I started visiting schools every Monday around the country to try and really understand what was happening with our education system. Not just with reading, but with the whole basis of the knowledge that's been taught and so on, and how we were teaching and what we were teaching. So back to Ruth. She explained to me that through the National Literacy Strategy, we had what's called in England the searchlights model of approach to reading, the multiple cueing that Emily Hanford talks about in her podcasts. So you have a little bit of phonics, maybe the first letter of the word. You have the knowledge of the context of the thing you're reading about, the grammatical knowledge, the context of what you're reading, and some word recognition as well. And also, of course, the picture cue as well. Ruth also introduced me to the Clackmannanshire study, which was very influential. This was a study conducted by a small local authority in Scotland. And they took 300 pupils. They divided them up into 3 groups. The first third would be taught a systematic synthetic phonics approach to reading. It was Jolly Phonics, the actual program. The second 2 groups were taught some form of analytical phonics, the approach that we took in England with the multiple cueing and other similar systems. After 16 weeks, this started in 1996, those children had, in the synthetic phonics group, had a word reading age 7 months ahead of their chronological age, and 8 or 9 months ahead of the other 2 groups. So morally, they had to bring all the 300 children into the synthetic phonics groups. But the 2 researchers, 2 academics, Rona Johnson from Hull University and Joyce Watson from St Andrews, both psychologists, they followed them for 7 years, and they published in 2004-05 this longitudinal study, the Clackmannanshire study. And at the end of those 7 years, these children had a word reading age of 3.5 years beyond their chronological age. They had a spelling age of 1 year, 9 months ahead of their reading age, chronological age, and a comprehension of 3.5 months ahead of their actual age. I'll come back to that point about why that comprehension was 3.5 months ahead rather than the big figures we saw for word reading later on. I also went on Ruth Miskin's training course. She was a head teacher before she set up her own phonics scheme called Read, Rethink. I went on a 2-day course in East London with other teachers and teaching assistants to really learn about how children should be taught to read using the most effective way. I got my committee that I was on, the Education Select Committee. This is still in the era when the Labour government were in. And the Select Committee took evidence from Ruth. They took evidence from Debbie Hebblewhite, took evidence from Rona Johnson, one of the 2 academics. And they recommended a review of the national curriculum into how reading is taught. And that led to the Rose Review that itself recommended that the government changes its policy to require phonics as the main source of teaching reading. So when we came into, and before the 2010 election, I went to see a school in North London, and to hear, I was going to see voluntary reading happening. It was a voluntary reading charity. They wanted me to see how they did it. And I went into this classroom, with the voluntary reader and this 9-year-old child who was struggling with reading. And she was really badly struggling. She was reading this book about dinosaurs. It had words in like Tyrannosaurus Rex. And she just couldn't read anything. Eventually, she got the word even, and there was great rejoicing. And I said, do you mind if I just cover up the first letter? So they said, OK, fine. So I covered up the first letter of even and asked her to read the word. And she couldn't read the word then. So this child, who's 9, 2 years away from secondary school, just had not been taught to decode words. On the way home, I rang Ruth Miskin and said, look, this is a terrible thing happened. I'm quite upset about it, and what can we do? And she said, look, I will tell this school, I will go to the school in my own time, and I'll teach that one girl to read, and I'll have a reading in 6 weeks. Rang the school, told them this, left a message with the head teacher's PA, never heard back. Very, very, very upsetting. And it just absolutely maybe determined that if we did win the election in 2010, we would do something about it. And so we did. So we got into office in 2010, and I was appointed schools minister. And we did a number of things. We strengthened the national curriculum, made it a requirement for all teachers to use systematic synthetic phonics in teacher reading. We funded materials and training for schools to use. We had a catalogue of approved phonics schemes that schools could buy with matched funding. We changed the Ofsted, the inspectorate, the way they inspect schools, requiring inspectors to hear the weakest children read. We introduced the phonics screening check. Next slide, please. So this is the phonics screening check. This is the 2016 one, but we actually piloted it in 2011. This is a test that 6-year-olds take, and that was controversial. How dare you test children so young? So it was done on a one-to-one basis. The 6-year-old would read to the teacher. It wouldn't take very long. There are only 40 words for the child to read. And the other controversial thing about this test is that half the words are made up. They're not real words. That's because we were designing it to make sure that schools were teaching decoding, and this just wasn't just a test of sight reading. So there were words like lig and mep and gax and emp. And we put a little picture of a monster by them so we don't confuse them. They're not trying to find a word that they think it is. So that's a kind of monster that we've called a mep. So half the words, 20 of the words were false, made up. The pass mark was determined by panels of teachers. They came up with 32 out of 40. When we piloted this in 2011, only 33% of children reached that expected standard of 32 correctly read words to their teacher, which I thought was alarming in itself, but it was a small pilot. We then rolled it out nationally, but it's compulsory for every primary school to take this test. And in the first year, I think we might have the next slide, 58% passed in the first year. Then every year that went on, the figures increased. And by the time we got to just pre-COVID, it went up to 82%. And then pre-COVID, then COVID didn't happen during COVID, and then it dived and went down to 75%, but then it went up to 79%. And I'm very confident that this year's tests will have shown it hopefully back up to where it was pre-COVID. I think we'll have the next slide as well. And you'll see that our PISA rankings in this period now in reading have risen. We've gone up from sort of 25th. This is England only, because we have a devolved system in the United Kingdom with each its own education policy. So England did this, Scotland did not do this, Wales did not do this. So we've gone from 25th in 2009, now we're up to 13th. But more importantly, in the Pearl study, next slide, we have gone from joint 10th in 2011 to joint 8th, and now in 2021 we are 4th in the world, behind Hong Kong, Singapore, and Russia. And so the Times, when this news came out, front page, was England is the best in the West in terms of reading. And it is due to phonics. And what's really satisfying about the Pearl study of 9-year-olds' reading ability is that it's the weakest readers that have pushed us up in our score. Our score's gone up because of the weakest readers, and that really was what we wanted to achieve. You know, every child should be reading. Now, going back to that Clackmannanshire study, the 3.5 months for comprehension compared to 3.5 years for word reading, all they did in Clackmannanshire, the only thing they changed there was phonics in those initial years, first and second years, getting children to read, to decode words. They didn't change anything else about how schools operate in terms of the frequency of reading. And what I do agree with your later additions to your podcast, Emily, was the importance of those other things. It's important that children practice reading. It's important we have a knowledge-rich curriculum, because the more knowledge you have, the more you can understand, the more you can read, the better reader you become. So knowledge is hugely important as well in terms of becoming an effective, fluent reader. So we didn't just do that, we changed the national curriculum in England, we brought in knowledge. I was very influenced by E.D. Hirsch and the schools we need and why we don't have them. And that policy is continuing to try and get more knowledge into our curriculum. So we got rid of the 2007, for example, competence-based curriculum that we had in England, and we now replaced it with a knowledge-rich curriculum. So there we are. That's our story. And I'm very pleased that now that if you go to schools, you will see phonics being taught in every single school, some better than others, Otherwise, it wouldn't be 82% getting the phonics screening, it would be 100%. But we are significantly ahead. And by the way, there are lots of schools in England that are getting 100%, in particularly, and in some very disadvantaged parts of the country. And I, as a minister, I would write to all those schools and congratulate them. I didn't care how many letters I had to sign. It's such an important message. But I think this works, and I think it can work anywhere in the world.
Before we leave the phonics check, I'm just curious, from this side of the Atlantic, this is controversial. And as a former elementary school teacher, I look at the phonics check and it seems simple and elegant and obvious, not that much different than Dibbles, for example, that we do here in the States. Why was this, and why does it continue to be so controversial, especially given the outcomes?
It was controversial because we test, all tests are controversial. So in the early 90s, we brought in tests at the end of primary school for reading, writing, and maths. And the results of those are published, the proportion passing for every school. So it's a very strong lever for accountability, and it was very controversial. The unions don't like it. And here we are testing 6-year-olds. I mean, this is just anathema. And even today, we get open letters to newspapers from educationists, early years, particularly the early years lobby, criticizing the phonics screening check.
Because you're testing them? Because 6-year-olds obviously get tested. They get assessed by teachers every day.
It's just because it's a high-stakes test upon which, although these aren't published, the way to make this land was I agreed not to publish it on a school-by-school basis. We collect the results nationally, we collect the results at the local authority level, but I agreed not to do it, publish it. But still, the inspectorate can see this, the local authority can see this, the people that hold these schools to account can see these results, and they do matter to them. So they are high stakes to that extent, and they don't like that. Children enjoy doing this test. It's not high stakes for the children. And we've just had a change of government from a Conservative government to a Labour government came in July. And the new government are continuing with this test. I think phonics now has really, but having said that, as I said, we do get open letters. We have them in 2011, we have them in 2014, we have them in 2022 even, condemning the existence of this test as being, putting pressure on schools and children, being expensive and being not very effective. But actually it is effective. It's been effective in changing practice throughout our school system. And now we will not find, children, I hope, like the 9-year-old girl I met, still struggling with that basic decoding skill.
I heard from a teacher who said about the phonics check, this is a teacher in England, she said, "It is the only assessment I've given which has elicited smiles and even chuckles from my students." So in her view, it's a lot of fun for the kids. I am very aware that it's very controversial, and they're introducing it in Australia. They've been talking about it in New Zealand. I don't know if there's I haven't heard much serious talk about implementing a phonics check in the United States. I mean, I haven't even heard that sort of on a district-wide basis, and it's interesting to me. I'm so glad you're here because I have been, down the rabbit hole of all of this stuff that, it sounds like about 15 or 20 years after you were. It sounds like you went down this rabbit hole in the early 2000s. And I've gone down the rabbit hole of how it's all played out over time and currently in the United States. And I have these folders in my computer, and I have this big one on England. And I've just always been like, and then there's England, and I need to know more about England, and I'm engaging with people on Twitter about it. And one of the things that I'm so curious about is, I don't know if this is accurate, so here's like a little hypothesis I have. It feels like we have England and the United States have a very similar history on all of this. Debates very similar, some of the same things being contested, all of that. But I feel like we sort of started to depart after about 2006. So you mentioned the Rose Report, which for the Americans in the room is kind of the equivalent of the National Reading Panel Report in the United States. So that was in 2000. You did a very similar one. But the Rose Report seemed to be really different in a couple of key ways. One, explicitly called out systematic synthetic phonics. And number two, it specifically talked about the simple view of reading, which is something that I talk about a lot in my reporting and with teachers because it really helps them understand why phonics is important. So I think we got sort of in a mess here in the United States where there was a lot, the National Reading Panel was telling us very clearly that phonics mattered, that it's good to do, that there are effects of doing it, that should be a foundation of teaching kids to read. And yet I just don't think a lot of teachers in America understood why it was so important. They didn't really understand how kids learn to read. The Rose Report, just when you read it, is so much clearer. Oh, this is laying out in a much better way than the National Reading Panel did, like how kids learn to read. And I'm kind of wondering if your national report helped move the needle on people's knowledge and understanding more quickly than in the United States.
I think it had an impact at the policy level. I don't think you will find many teachers will have read. They're busy people.
Yeah, right.
They will have read the Rose Review, but it did have an impact. So this happened as a consequence of a select committee that I was on, and it happened under the Labour government. So I think that helped. It helped us land the policy when we came into office in 2010, because already the opposing party was sort of pro-phonics and had done quite a few things in getting that show on the road. So there wasn't that sort of battle between the parties in terms of phonics. The battle really was with the education academics in the universities and the early years people who didn't buy into the agenda. So, I mean, we were being opposed the whole time. I was told I was just teaching children to bark at print. So as if this, it's although they won't understand what they're reading. The whole essence was that there was a conflation about comprehension with decoding. They were trying to do both at once through the way that they were encouraging children to multiple cue, to identify words, but they're separate things in the way the scales of a piano, learning to play a piano, are different from playing a piece of Mozart. So I think all these intellectual battles, these battles of ideas, they still had to be waged, even with the great work that Jim Rose did in that report.
But it is interesting because even what you just said, it seems like you got closer as a policy-wise, and the battle was still among teacher education and among teachers themselves. I feel like you're about 10 years ahead of us in terms of the way the debate has played out.
Yes, I think we are. I think we can talk this more widely. I think we're ahead of a lot of countries in terms of the teaching profession as well, who have taken back control of their own profession. I was saying earlier about the Prime Minister of England in 1976, called Jim Callaghan, Labour Prime Minister, made a speech, unusual for a Prime Minister in those days, about education, because in the mid-70s, the British education system was absolutely terrible. It really was. We'd had years of reform between 1964 onwards, brought in all the progressive stuff from America. A lot of this stuff came, by the way.
Sorry.
So Teachers College, Columbia University.
So sorry.
So a lot of this stuff came in, and so our school system was very, we had this thing called the Black Papers that people were discussing, the terrible things happening in our comprehensive schools and so on. And so the Prime Minister made a speech about it and said, and one thing first of all he said, I was choose to criticize for making the speech. How dare I, a Prime Minister of this country, talk about education, which belongs to the education academics. But he also talked about these informal methods of learning, he mentioned. He also mentioned a national curriculum, he mentioned inspectorate. So these ideas were already bubbling away. But what we have done in this country, in England rather, is that we have, if you like, liberated the teaching profession now. They are in this secret garden. The gates have fallen away. They are blogging and writing profusely, a huge, in great volume. And they attend these conferences called Research Ed, which was founded by Tom Bennett in this country. 1,000 teachers would turn up on a Saturday to debate evidence-based approaches to education. So I feel now that we are ahead of quite a few countries in the world, most countries in the world, in terms of the teaching profession actually debating curriculum, debating pedagogy in a way they never used to.
Yeah.
Okay, Emily tried out one of her theories. I'll try out one of mine now. My assumption, which you can divorce me of, is that, England has, there's a national system. We don't have a national system here in the US, obviously. We have, at best, 50 state systems, and more accurately, 14,000 school districts and a strong tradition of local control. My assumption, if you're 10 years or more ahead of us, it's because it's just simply easier in a national system to get teachers to change their practice, as opposed to what we have here in the US.
Well, there may be structural differences in terms of the system, but the teaching profession is a profession, and teachers expect to be in charge of of what they do in the classroom. So we have the same issues in England. You have to use the levers that you have. And my view has always been, as a minister, get the documentation right first. It's a phrase I always use. Let's get the documentation right. So we got the national curriculum right. It was absolutely worded properly. And then you have to think about accountability and what kind of levers can you can you move to make, by the way, all the levers I got in the Department for Education were all made of rubber, or they weren't connected at all. So you have to be, you have to be smart about this. You have to work out, well, what are the incentives? Well, the inspectorate's a big incentive. This test was very important, although I had to make sure it landed with the unions and so on. So that's why it wasn't published. But you just have to be smart. And I don't believe in the states, with all the complexities of 50 different states and all the different school boards, you can't come up with similar things that are devised nationally, but we should roll out at a local level. We have 150 local authorities in this country, in England as well. So we have all those kinds of issues. But you are right. Nationally, we have one national. Well, four nations, but one England.
You invoked both the national curriculum and the inspectorate system. For those who don't understand your accountability system, you have Ofsted. Could you just briefly explain how that works, and how did that factor into changing practice?
Well, Ofsted, they go and inspect schools every sort of 3 years or so. And
they physically go into schools?
Go, but not for long, 2 or 3 days.
Which is 2 or 3 days longer than we do it here.
Right. And I know a couple of people. But they do look at the data. And they will look at the phonics screening check data. They'll look at the SATs, the tests that primary school kids take, and they'll look at the GCSE and A-level results as well. And they'll look at the behaviour that they see in the school. So that is important. So we did ask Ofsted, as part of these tools, to listen to the weakest readers read. That was in the framework of how in the handbook, we changed the handbook, so that the schools knew that they, from a random list of children in order of how weak they are in reading, that the inspector would choose the children to hear read, and that has an impact. And then, of course, these results will impact on the Ofsted judgment. Although, there were some schools I noticed getting good judgments with very weak phonics. So all these, you can lay the best laid plans, and then in reality, it doesn't always work. But you try and you change those things when they don't go well. So that did have a huge impact.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
National curriculum.
So we have
fond hope for some of us here. It's never going to happen. That pesky little constitution.
We do have a national curriculum. So we changed that because the national curriculum used to be run by a quango, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation, and I felt that it got out of control. So we got rid of the quango. We brought policymaking in-house into the department. So we wrote the national curriculum with experts, and we consulted, of course, on it. So it wasn't just ministers deciding, it was done through huge consultation. But it is a national curriculum, and it's compulsory for all what's called maintained schools, local authority schools. Not, by the way, compulsory for our equivalent of your charter schools, academies. They don't have to follow the national curriculum. They do have to teach the GCSEs, they do have to do the phonics check, they do have to do the SATs and so on, but they don't technically have to follow the national curriculum. But that is a way of influencing policy. But you need multiple levers. You can't just use the national curriculum. You get the documentation right, but it isn't enough. It's never enough. And the other thing that worries me is that even what we've achieved in England is the phonics screening check, 82% pass. And if they don't pass it in year 1, when they're 6, the child has to take it again in the following year, year 2. And by year 2, if you include the year 2 results and the year 1 results, the overall figure is 92% of children are passing this phonics screening check. So my question then is, if they can get 92 by year 2, why can't they get 92 by year 1? And if they can get 92 by year 1, why can't they get 95, given that there are lots of schools getting 100%? But the other figure I haven't mentioned is the figure for disadvantaged children. It's not 82, it's 72% pass. And this isn't a test that's culturally dependent. You don't need books at home. You don't need trips to the theatre to pass the phonics screening check. You just need to be taught it. It's a mechanical thing. And so why is there a difference? There's a difference, in my view, because in some schools in leafy suburbs where the teaching of phonics is weak, the children from advantaged homes come to school already reading. They pass the test. They're the 82. The children from disadvantaged homes come to school. They don't learn at school, and they're that 10% gap who don't pass it. So we've got to. So we've done all these things, all these levers that I've mentioned, but it's still not perfect. So how do you do that? So what we did is, a few years later on, is we identified 20, 30, 40, 50 schools that do it really well. And then we got some experts in to train them to do it even better. So they were absolutely brilliant at phonics teaching. And then we asked them gave them some money to spread this thing. We call these things the English hubs. And they're spreading that practice into other schools. But it's a slow process. These schools can do 10, 20, 30, maybe 100 schools in a couple of years each. We've got 17,000 primary schools. It takes time, but that's what you have to do. You've just got to train and make the arguments, win hearts and minds.
I mean, it really, it's impressive results, even if it's not perfect, on phonics, and you're really doing a good job, and it looks like you're making great strides on that. And I was looking at some of the PEARLS data. So the PEARLS, correct me if I'm wrong, that's 9-year-olds, 4th graders, right? So that is testing some reading comprehension. And one of the things that was impressive about the PEARLS performance is that the strongest predictor of how kids do on that test in 4th grade was their score on the year 1 phonics check. So there's a real correlation there, and that was the number of the books in the home was next, followed by socioeconomic status. So that's pretty impressive. However, as we know from the research and from your results in England, it's about much more than phonics, right? Phonics is just a foundation. It's kind of a must-have, but it's not enough. And so even though on that, I think you showed us that you're getting about 82, was it 82%? But I think when you look at that SAT test a few years later, the comprehension is significantly lower. So what's the conversation now in England then about, okay, so you really get it right with phonics, now what? What else to make sure that you are actually really getting up to, say, 82, 90% of kids really being able to do well on a test in 4th grade, on a test in high school?
Yes, I mean, this is absolutely right. Phonics is a necessary condition for reading, but it's not a sufficient condition. And so children need to practice. They need to practice reading. And they need to practice reading, well, first of all, when they're first learning their phonics, they need to practice reading with decodable books. And it upset me that some children were kind of losing confidence because they'd learned, not the whole thing. They learned some letters, not others, and yet they were given a book with elephant in them. Right. And they haven't done the PH. And it does undermine confidence. So we need to try and make sure that schools are using decodable books. So that's a key task, which I've not been 100% successful about that. They then need to practice reading. And it's getting that reading habit into schools that's another absolutely essential. And then the third thing is knowledge, because vocabulary is important for comprehension. The wider your vocabulary, the more knowledge you have about octopuses or whatever it is, the more you understand what you're reading. But at least with phonics, you can sound out the word octopus and ask, what the heck is that? You can go and ask somebody. But if you want to be a fluent, successful reader, you need to have knowledge. And we have sought through our national curriculum review to bring knowledge back into the curriculum. It is more detailed at primary in math, in reading, and math, English, and science. More high level at secondary, but the GCSEs, of course, are now more knowledge rich than they were. And we had a thing up until 2007 that was called a competence-based curriculum. This is all the rage around the world, the OECD, and everyone talks about a competence-based curriculum, outcomes-based curriculum, but based on this academic skills, the learning how to learn skills, that somehow being a critical thinker can be taught, or a problem solver, or being creative can be taught. Of course, we want all those things in our children. Absolutely, particularly in advanced economies like America and England, where being a creative person is the source of our country's wealth. But you don't get those things by teaching. Today's lesson is creativity. You become creative because you've been introduced to great artists and music. You have read, you're a problem solver because you know a lot of science and a lot of mathematics, and a critical thinker because you learn a lot about the humanities and the problems that the world has faced and currently faces. That's how you acquire those skills. And there's a lot of people who've written about that, including Hirsch and Daisy Christodoulou in England in a book called 7 Myths About Education. So we got rid of all that in 2007. So any country that's listening to this and thinking about, we're going to introduce a competence-based curriculum, 21st century skills, just come and look at England and what we went through.
This is where I agree with Emily that you are 10 years or more ahead of us. I worked at the Core Knowledge Foundation circa 2008, 2009, and Michael Gove was a big fan of E.D. Hirsch Jr. E.D. Hirsch founded Core Knowledge, and I remember there was a lot of discussion about how Hirsch was more lionized in England than he was in his own state of Virginia. How did that happen?
It happened, I read his book on a beach in America, Hilton Head Beach, because my researcher discovered him, and he said, you have to read this book. I said, no, I want to read a novel. So no, you have to read this book. So my other half actually.
Someone owes you a vacation.
Yeah, I'm on holiday. I would read this books like this when I'm on holiday. But Michael, my other half, read it, and he said, "You have to read this book." So I did, and it just transformed. Now I have the copy that I took, and it's all dog-eared and noted, and so. And then I made everybody read it. I bored everyone to death, but journalists, Michael Gove, everybody. Everyone had to read it. I believe I am the introducer of Hearst to England, not Dan William. I did not introduce Dan William to England. That was Daisy Christodoulou. He'd been hugely influential. He came over to England, actually, for a policy exchange, and it was wonderful meeting him. And yes, he was lionised. It was great. He has had a huge influence. And now everybody now in England talks about a knowledge-rich curriculum, even when it isn't always a knowledge-rich curriculum. At least they're using the term knowledge-rich curriculum. So people understand why it's important. And now cognitive load theory, that Daniel Willingham talk about the working memory and the importance of having knowledge in your long-term memory so that you can be a critical thinker and a problem solver. The things that take place in the short-term memory, the working memory, that can only hold half a dozen, if that, new bits of information at once. That has become influential now in England, and we have incorporated that thinking of cognitive load theory into our teacher training.
But I do want to ask you about teacher training, but the picture you're painting suggests to me, at least as a former teacher, a greater receptiveness on the part of UK teachers to these ideas, to knowledge-rich curriculum, to cognitive load theory. It's not like these ideas are unknown here in the US. They just don't seem to have gained traction the way they have in the UK. Or am I misreading?
No.
And if I'm right about that, what is the difference in the teaching culture in the UK that is allowing them to put down roots where they're not here?
I think I don't know much about America, but I thought that the teaching culture in America and England is the same. They're people that go into teaching because they really want to teach children, and they do it for all the right reasons. What I found in England was that these ideas, what I would call progressivist ideas, had become so entrenched, so cemented into the system through local authorities, through the Department for Education, through these quasi-autonomous bodies, these quangos, through the professors of education in the educational faculties of the university, the teacher training institutions of our country, that actually we had to blow up the concrete to allow teachers to not be forced by all those pressures to be adherents to the thought world of progressivist education. So that's why we sought to take control of schools away from local authorities through the academization programs. Now, you equate them to charter schools, but 80% of secondary schools in England are academies. They have autonomy. They are not run by the local authority. So all that influence of the education establishment that rested in the local authorities now is not impacting on those secondary, and 40% of primary is now academies. So that's one thing we did. We tried to give more control to teachers, to schools, about over how they train and where they train their teachers through school direct. So now half of teachers are trained through that system, although there's still a lot of university involvement. So, we abolished the Quango, we abolished the qualification curriculum agency that was busy introducing the competence-based curriculum with almost no ministerial oversight, as I could tell. So we got rid of them. And then we had ministers, Michael Gove, myself, others, in the Department for Education who are absolutely determined to change the zeitgeist, to change these ideas, because we saw it. And I spent 5 years as the shadow minister for schools, touring schools, understanding the system and realizing that these ideas were what were causing the problem. Mm-hmm. That's why we were declining in PISA, because children weren't being taught reading properly, they weren't being taught maths properly, they weren't being taught knowledge, and so we had to change it. But I think we've started the process.
I do think that our hypothesis that you're about 10 or 15 years ahead of us is being well established here. And so I want to pick your brain about a few things that I feel like are really at the forefront for a lot of American schools who are really having this good, vigorous debate among their teachers. Like, I think that's one of the things that's happening right now in the United States. It is becoming more about something that teachers are talking about amongst each other. They're understanding about things like, beginning to understand about things like cognitive load theory. We have research ed here. I think there's a lot of interest among teachers around how kids learn to read and how kids learn in general. One of the things that I hear about a lot is that as schools are starting to rethink how they do early reading instruction and maybe getting to the point of like getting more solid with a particular approach to phonics and getting kids, solid on those skills, what about the older readers? So what did you do in England while you were reforming things at the early years and at the very same time you already had 10, 11, 15-year-olds who had missed out on that? What do you do about them?
Well, we had those tests, those primary school tests, and so we are holding schools to account for the ability of children to read to quite a sophisticated level. So when we changed the national curriculum, the new curriculum became law in 2014. It was much tougher, much more rigorous. It had a grammar, spelling. The grammar thing was very controversial. The new test came in 2016, and schools were held to account, and all schools went down initially because they were getting used to this new curriculum. Then it started to drift up again. So we put a lot of pressure on schools to make sure that no child slipped through that net. We expected schools through Ofsted, through local authorities, through other oversight regimes, to make sure that they're identifying who those children are who are still struggling with reading. And lots of reading schemes have remedial schemes for children that have missed out, for slightly older children, and they're expected to do that to make sure no child is missing out. And some children, as I said, earlier on in this discussion, in secondary school are still struggling. We've had a reading age significantly below their actual age, and we wanted to help secondary schools also understand how you teach phonics as well. It's not just for primaries. It shouldn't be necessary at secondary. It really shouldn't, but it still is. So they also are expected to help those children to read as well.
Yeah, so should I come to England to see how you do it at the secondary level? Because it's really vexing to people here. Who's going to teach the kids and what part of the day using what person who has the skills? Like once a kid gets to our upper elementary, middle school, there's no sort of place to teach them how to read.
No, but that's why accountability is so important. We have very strong accountability. It's not just the inspectorate, it's also the performance tables. We publish these results. And there are consequences for senior leaders of schools that don't do well. And we get a lot of criticism for that because we're putting pressure on head teachers to do well. And so you will find that secondary schools that have intakes of pupils, a decreasing number, I hasten to add, of children who start secondary school still struggling, they will have remedial lessons in place. They will test the children when they start in year 7. And they will bring in experts from the primary sector to help those. It'll be a small subset of children to make sure that they can't allow, our accountability system now is so strong, they cannot allow a child for their own professional future to go through the secondary system, not able to read and access the curriculum, because they are held to account. And it's not just, our accountability system used to just be on the CD borderline of GCSEs. The performance measure in the tables was what proportion of your 16-year-olds get at least 5 GCSEs at grades A to C. We changed that to a progress measure. So now you get score points for getting a very low ability child just up a little bit. So there's incentives in our system for every child to do better than they were doing. And I believe that is happening.
I'm going to get on my high horse a little bit about accountability, which I've made the point here in the States. And I'm not anti-accountability, but the logic of accountability, test-driven accountability, the way we practice it here in the US is that, schools and teachers know what to do, we just need to hold you accountable. And whenever that comes up, I always ask, well, where'd you get that idea? In the US, because having gone through teacher education, I can assure you, I was not exactly prepared to be held accountable. I was earnest, but ill-prepared. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about teacher training in the UK, and because here I think we have a bit of an arm's length relationship with it. We assume, for good or for ill, that it's so badly broken that it can't be fixed. At least it seems to have evaded accountability for the most part. So the accountability works when teachers know what to do, but how confident are you that the teachers know what to do?
And I agree with that totally. I had a period out of office between for political things to do with the coalition. I was quite cross about it at the time. But I was out between September 2012 and July 2014. And I kind of visited schools, continued to visit schools. And I was then on the other side, I was a trustee of a big multi-academy trust and understood the pressure teachers were under. And I took the view then, I formed the view that actually most teachers, I would say 99% of teachers are conscientious, intelligent, hardworking people who want to do the best for their children. And the reason if they fail or their school fails is because they're doing the wrong thing. So it's beholden on the system then to make sure that teachers are trained in what the right things are. And so we looked at teacher training. We didn't, we were doing so much when we came into office in 2010. We didn't, other than give schools more control over their teacher training, we didn't reform the educational faculties of the universities, the teacher training. We started in about 2018, so 8 years in we did. And what we did is we looked at the early careers of teachers. So in those first 2 years, it's young 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds coming into schools. We just made them develop their own lesson plans. And of course, 1 in 10 left. We just put so much pressure on these young people, their first job, their first flat, everything else. So we decided to create an early career framework of 2-year support with a mentor and a structured approach to the training that was delivered by external bodies. And the framework of that was written with oversight by the Education Endowment Foundation, a What Works body, to make sure that it was evidence-led. And it had things in it like cognitive load theory. It had things in it about how to manage a classroom and behavior and so on like that. And so we did that, and it landed well. There's extra money for the mentoring and so on, and the time away from lessons to do this training. Then we took the same principles that I did so well, evidence-based, and we pushed them upstream into the initial teacher training. And that was called the Core Content Framework, built very much on the same principles, signed off by the Education Endowment Foundation, and it was accepted by the institutions. We were then worried about whether it was actually being implemented. So we had a market review conducted by a man called Sir Ian Borkham, and basically then all the teacher training institutions had to reaccredit themselves and demonstrate to a review panel in the department that they were in compliance with the core content framework. And then there's a second stage to make sure that their documentation and their teaching materials was in compliance with what they said they were doing. And a few universities didn't get through that process. But it has meant now that we've done everything we can to make sure that the universities are training our teachers in accordance with what teachers need in the classroom and in accordance with what the evidence says is the most effective way of teaching.
But I don't want to put words in your mouth. It sounds like you were a lot more willing to use the power of accreditation than we have historically been here in the US.
Yes, and it was controversial. And I'm not frightened of controversy, but there were universities that said to us, "You are infringing on our academic freedoms, and this is a great point of principle." And I said, "Well, you are also our supplier. We are paying you a lot of money every year to train our teachers, and you need to make sure that you're training them in accordance with what the evidence says. You can do whatever you want on top of that. If you want to teach them all kinds of things, you're very welcome to do that. But you have to deliver this core content framework because that's what you are our supplier." It's very interesting in your podcast, Emily, you talked about some of the institutions wanting to continue to teach the multiple queuing methods because they have to learn about this system academically. I'm sure that's happening. I've heard academics say that in this country.
Right. Well, they partly have to learn it because they say, well, we have to prepare them for what's going on in schools. Yes. We have to teach them it because it's what they're expected to do when they get to schools. Yeah. But I think that's changing, and it's I think there's a tipping point here between sort of what the schools want and need and what the teacher prep programs are teaching. And I think we're in a situation where there's more openness to new knowledge and changing things among the schools than writ large, on average, than among the teacher preparation programs. But many of the education markets in the United States are very local in that there's a couple of big school systems and all the teachers are coming from a few institutions, or most of them are. And so I think there are some examples of sort of local pressure where the school systems are saying, we're not going to hire your teachers unless you change the way you prepare them. Now, some of them are just, desperate for teachers and they can't live up to that threat, but they're making it in some cases. But did you actually, you mentioned that there were some schools when you changed the process of sort of a teacher accreditation that weren't able to get through. So are they no longer, what happened to them?
So we worry, like all developed nations, we worry about getting enough teachers.
Yeah.
And to have a strong economy, graduates are in great supply. So they can't accredit themselves. They have to work with somebody who is accredited. So the institution can continue, but they have to go through an institution that is accredited. And the idea behind that is because that's, you want to have regional spread of teacher training institutions. But they then have to follow the curriculum and approach of the accredited institution.
Interesting.
I've been remiss in not giving out the Twitter hashtag for those who are following online and want to ask Minister Gibb a question. It's hashtag Gibb at AEI, or you can use the email address that was on the event flyer, riley.fletcher@aei.org. We'll be going to questions in just a few minutes. One thing we haven't discussed at all is the role of parents. I'm going to guess here that these reforms were quite popular with parents, as I assume they would be here in the U.S., because phonics is one of those things that you don't have to be an expert to understand. Oh, of course I want my child to learn how to read phonetically.
Yes, and it is nice, because for whatever reason, I'm associated in England with phonics and this issue. So I meet parents who say, "Oh, I thought of you when my child was reading," because they were sounding out the words. They were using phonics, and we attribute that to your government. And so that is. So I think parents are. You do hear children just sounding out words, and they're doing it within days and weeks of starting
But
school.
did that give you political wind in your sails, as it were, for these reforms?
Yes, for the reforms, absolutely, it did. I mean, parents generally don't like testing, I sense.
Right.
I mean, being on sort of TV interviews, and you have one of the interviewers who is a parent going with their child who's age 11, going through the SATs tests and being quite aggressive. I mean, the interviewers are quite aggressive generally, obviously, present company accepted.
Maybe I can be. Look out.
But they get very aggressive when come SATs week in May sometimes. So that's not popular. But I make the point then that those SATs, then they're not qualifications for those 11-year-olds. They have no impact they should have no impact on the children. It's about the school and holding the school to account. But they do tend. Whereas I have not had the same sort of pushback from those kind of interviews on the phonics screening check.
So if Emily's right, and I agree that we are 10 or 15 years behind you, and we are largely due, I think, to Emily's efforts, having a science of reading moment here in this country, give us your best advice, while being mindful of the different contexts and the different systems that we have. If you can cast your mind back to where you were 10 or 15 years ago, any missteps that are, whether it's practice or policymakers should be wary of? How can we maintain momentum for this long overdue moment that we're having here in the States?
Well, Emily Hamford, your podcasts have been hugely helpful and influential, and that I think winning the battle of ideas is hugely important in this and any other area of public policy in a democracy. So that's stage one. And I think also, I say you need to get the documentation right, even though that is only the first step. And I think accountability is key, actually. So I don't know whether there are any states that might like to borrow our phonics screening check. I mean, I went to Australia in 2017 at the invitation of the Federal Education Minister, Simon Birmingham, and we went to Adelaide in South Australia and spoke there. And then the following year they did introduce it in 2018. And with our help, they basically took our same one that you saw on the screen. They took, and officials worked with officials in South Australia to get it. And now it's in several states in South Australia and expanding. So we're very happy to work with any states in the United States that want to, or any school board that wants to adopt the phonics screening check. I don't think it's proprietary. There are a limited number of false words, and there are a limited number of even words that are simple for children to read. So sometimes they don't like to publish them too widely, those tests, but they would certainly work with, and we're very happy to help. It's very important.
Another way of asking Robert's question is, Did you make any mistakes along the way that you would rethink, oh, we did that wrong, that was a misstep?
Well, if I could, across our education model, lots of mistakes, and unquestionably. I'm just trying to think about
On this issue in particular.
on this issue of reading. I'm not sure. I think it's a pompous thing to say. No, we made no mistakes. I'm sure that we have, but it's certainly been an effective way. The combination of, I suppose, as I said, it goes back to that point I made earlier about I am worried about this 72% difference between disadvantaged kids and non-disadvantaged. There should not be a gap. And so my question to myself is, could we have done more to improve the quality of phonics teaching? So everybody knows they have to do it. They've got the test, and they've got the Ofsted inspection and so on. But did we do enough in those early years to help them do it properly? And that would be my answer to your question. Could we have done more training? In 2010, we were facing a massive budget deficit, annual deficit of 11%. 1 year's spending of 11% of GDP is how much extra we were spending than we had. 156 billion pound deficit each year. We had to so we were going through a period of austerity, and we didn't have the kind of money to throw at the system to do that kind of training. But I think now, if you have the money, I would put a lot of money into really high quality training of teachers in how to teach phonics. So the English hubs thing I was telling you about, I think if you could do that more widely with more money thrown at it, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely something that we need to do more of here in the United States, which is I think we often are looking to particular sort of like programs or practices, and we're asking questions about whether there's evidence for these practices, and we're not often doing the admittedly very messy work of saying, where are the schools or districts that are doing really well, and let's go study them and learn from them. I mean, there is this whole effective schools research, which I think we need to pay more attention to, and take what the lessons we can learn from effective schools and school systems and see and bake those things into policy in a way that maybe we haven't consistently done.
Yes. Well, you're challenging one of my cherished notions, which is that it's very, very difficult to change classroom practice by pulling policy levers. So since we are in a policy arena here, are there any, for your fellow policy people, are there any suggestions that you would make to the degree that you can translate them into an American context? Do you feel you've been successful? I mean, clearly you feel that you've been successful changing practice through policy. How do we replicate that?
Well, I think first of all, knowing your own mind, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and it's not just dealing with the day-to-day politics. You need a long-term approach and understanding what you're trying to achieve. And Michael Gove and I, we'd spent years together in opposition preparing for this. So there were multiple strands of things we were ready to do, get the curriculum change and so on, the accountability. So I think accountability is probably the most important thing that you can do to change practice, because that really concentrates the minds of professionals. They've got to do this thing because they're going to be held to account for it. So for example, on the knowledge, I was very worried that too many schools were teaching GCSE subjects that weren't rigorous. They weren't choosing necessarily the sciences, or they were choosing sort of, I don't like to name them because then that, I get in all kinds of trouble for being disparaging about certain subjects, but there were subjects that were not part of that core academic of physics, chemistry, biology, maths, English, history, geography, foreign language. They were studying subjects from 14 onwards that weren't those. And guess who was being pushed into those subjects? It was always the kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Your advantaged kids, they'd always be doing those core subjects, those core academic subjects, because their parents knew that that's what gave the widest opportunities later at A-level and beyond. So we brought in an accountability measure called the English Baccalaureate, which was those subjects. Mm-hmm. What proportion of children at 16 in this school and that school were entered for that combination? And that did change behavior. Overnight, it changed behavior. And now, history's gone up, geography's gone up, foreign languages has gone up a bit, and science, 66%, 68% in 2010 did at least 2 sciences. Now that figure's 96%. So what were the other 30% doing? They were doing core science, very weak subject content of science. And guess who those 30 percentage points people are, children are? They are the most disadvantaged children. So now, almost every child, regardless of background, is doing solid science at GCSE. And all this, what's this got to do with reading? All this helps. General knowledge, getting knowledge in your long-term memory, all helps with reading.
Am I wrong, by the way, to assume that there's an Ofsted effect? And I think of myself as when I was a classroom teacher, you behave differently when you're being observed. If you've got the state sitting in the back of your classroom, granted it's not every teacher, it's not every school, but that has to have an effect as opposed to you're just going to judge me by my test scores.
Yes, and yeah, we were worried about what Ofsted were requiring. Because, Ofsted is 3,000 odd inspectors, all teachers of varying degrees of experience and so on. And when we first came into office, Ofsted was not a force for good, in fact. They were going around saying in their reports, oh, there's too much teacher talking, there's too much teacher-led, there's not enough project work, not enough group work. So they had their own view about what...
You had to reform them.
Sorry?
You had to reform them.
Yes, exactly. We brought in a new chief inspector who changed that. and we first of all had to just stop them having their own view of lessons, not to have a new view, but just to stop them having a view. Because otherwise, all our reforms were landing, on stony ground because Ofsted was a bigger force of influence than we were. So we had to stop them, these inspectors, going around saying, there's too much teacher talk or there's too much so on. So, yeah.
Okay. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I'm going to take a few offline. And forgive me, I'm not checking my emails here. I'm taking questions from Twitter. Nick, how do you respond to criticisms of England's method that England's method of phonics instruction is joyless and too rigid? This is certainly something we hear in the States as well.
No, I heard that criticism was made in your podcast, Emily, that it's boring to have to teach the letters, the sounds, b, k, and can you get that? Can you do that instantly without? And then can you blend them into words? Cat. But it's not boring for the children because they can read. What joy to have accomplished this extraordinary thing that you don't learn naturally in the way you learn to talk or you learn to walk. It's an artificial construct that mankind has developed, and you have to be actively taught it. And here these children, within weeks of starting school, can read simple words. So I just don't buy the fact it's dry and boring. It's absolutely not. It doesn't have to be for the teachers either. What could be more satisfying for a teacher than to see these children who couldn't read when they started in your class? Now they can. I mean, that is deeply satisfying, I'd have thought, for a professional.
But how do you in England deal with the fact that kids are at very different places in terms of their phonics knowledge? So like if you have a kid who's in the first year of school who really could pass the phonics check right away, are they able to accelerate and go be in with different kids? Like I think one of the things that I'm finding that is a feature of successful instruction is something that's a little bit antithetical to a lot of education reform in America over the past several years, which is you really have to think about grouping kids and letting the kid. I've been in a school where a first grader who was reading at a third grade level went for reading instruction time with the other third graders. Are you able to do that in England?
Yes, you can do that. Or you could, if you have a 2-form entry or even a 3-form entry primary school, you could divide those children up into 3 groups, have the strongest.
So it sort of depends on the school, how they do it.
It depends on the school. I'm in favour of what we call in England setting by ability, but at secondary level, because at secondary level, the kind of what's in the curriculum can be quite challenging for some children and less challenging for others. They diverge quite widely at secondary. At primary, generally speaking, I believe in this what we call a concept of mastery. We want every child to master the whole curriculum, because I was always dismayed by going into a primary school and the teacher would say, that's the blue table, They don't do long division because they're never going to get it. Absolutely not. Every child who leaves primary school should be doing long division and basic algebra, regardless of ability. This isn't string theory. They will get it if they're given long enough to do it.
But that's a little different than making a kid who already has mastered the letters and sounds and the phonics sequence or whatever to still have to do that every day.
No, and you can, as I said, you could do separate groupings, but and there are ways that teachers can challenge children But just speaking personally, I have, there's a lot of people who believe in mixed ability teaching at secondary. And it's a battle I'm prepared to wage at secondary because of as I said, the way the ability diverges. But at primary, I'm just concerned about the blue table. And if that means the children on the red table have to be given extra work at another time, whole class teaching I just think is so important. And I wouldn't want us to get, what we had in England, and we probably still do have, is you have children sitting like this in groups and around tables, and not too much whole class teaching going on, and there's a teaching assistant helping that table and teach. All the evidence is that whole class teaching is the most efficient and effective way of teaching children, and that will mean that a super bright kid at the front, knows this stuff. But a good teacher will know that, and they will give that child extra things to do, but still be part of the whole class.
In the back of my head, there's that refrain from teacher training: be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. But maybe not in England. We have microphones here. I'm not sure if we've got questions. If not, I'll continue to take them right here. Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex. I work at Yale Haynes Public Charter School, and we use synthetic phonics. And what's on my mind is I think one of the most common downfalls of ed reforms is when we overpromise about a particular form being a panacea. And I think that the science of reading has kind of taken on that outsized sense of being a panacea. And I think today we sort of discovered that I think we're using the word reading and decoding interchangeably, possibly falsely. It's really sort of the science of decoding is what we're doing here in synthetic phonics. And so I guess two-part question. One is I wonder the extent to which anyone on stage is concerned about the overpromising function of what we've done either on Sold a Story or in England, talking about the impacts of phonics instruction versus the actual outcomes, especially as kids age. Secondly, related to kids aging, we've said multiple times today that England's 10 to 15 years ahead of the US, but I think we see that on the phonics check, we're at 82%. By Pearls, the percentage has gone down, and then by PISA at age 15, the results are really different, and the US is actually 10 points ahead of the UK and ranked 9th instead of 13th in reading. So I wonder, do we care more about kids' ability to decode words or really read at the high level that we want adults to make meaning from text? So I know that was sort of a multi-pronged question, but curious to hear reflections.
Go ahead.
Well, you need the phonics. It is. I mean, decoding is the first stage of reading, and I've never said, and all the people who debate this issue in England have never said that that's the end of the story. It is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, but it's a separate policy area, because the 9-year-old girl who couldn't read the word then, she's not comprehending anything. So we have to get that right, and there are lots of problems still with our education system in England. We went down this track of competence-based curriculum and so on long before we introduced the 2007 curriculum. Before that, it was that kind of approach to. So there are other problems you have to deal with. This won't deal with all those. So there's all that debate still to be had in England as well. So. Yeah, so there's, so that's why the debate we're having in England about knowledge is so important.
I mean, I think you raise a really important, significant question that needs to be dealt with, and I think this sort of idea, like, should we worry about sort of decoding or reading comprehension? I think the thing that we need to help people understand is that the decoding is an essential element to that reading comprehension, but it's not enough. And you look at all kinds of education research, you look at what's happening in England, you look at places that have been successful in the United States, and what you see is that you can actually have, if you do it well, a really good impact in decoding, and it's a lot harder to have an impact on the comprehension part. And one of the things that I've been thinking is if we could, this is actually in some ways the easier part, teaching phonics and assessing kids' phonics, the assessment of it is actually much easier. And so we've been really quite on the wrong track with that for so long. So this is like a reset, let's get this right. And then it opens us up to a much bigger question about, okay, then what? Now it's at like so many more very critical, important questions about what are the kids being taught? What are they learning? What do we want them to learn? What is in the curriculum? So many more things if we could get this reading right. So I think your question is exactly the right one. And I wanted to go back to the littlest part of your question. Something that I don't think we defined here is we've said the term synthetic phonics a few times. And I actually think it might be just important to just have one moment of saying what that is, because there are a lot of different ways to think about and approach phonics, and synthetic phonics is a very specific thing. Do you want to just define it?
Yes, so my understanding is it was a term coined by people that believe in phonics. And the reason why they had to have a sort of a prefix to the word phonics was because the whole word people were starting to do multiple queuing, were saying, well, there is phonics in our scheme, so this is phonics, but we call it analytical phonics because we're analyzing the word and we're identifying the letter after we've got the word. And so that's why this distinction comes in. But what synthetic phonics really is, it's just basically phonics. The synthesized comes with the blending notion.
It's really starting from the level of the sounds. I mean, that's another thing that I think is very important. One of the big debates we're having in the United States right now has to do with sort of phonemic awareness and its role and how much it should be taught and when it should be taught, and if you do it with letters and without letters. And synthetic phonics, as my understanding, takes a very clear approach that you start with the sounds and the letters and you blend those together to make words, rather than analytical phonics or other ways where you're starting more from the words or parts of words and going down. It's going from the bottom up. It's really trying to take advantage of what do kids' spoken language abilities, and then teaching them how the words that they know how to say then are represented, those sounds in the words are represented by letters. I think synthetic phonics is an unfortunate adjective that they chose, because synthetic just sounds like something you don't want in schools. Yeah, right. Something synthetic. Yeah, I don't know.
Alex, I want to thank you for introducing the phrase science of decoding to me, because I'm now going to adopt it, because I think it's a terrific phrase, because that's exactly what we're talking about, is the science of decoding. My only contribution to this is and I don't want to be the skunk at yet another picnic, I taught in the lowest performing school in the lowest performing district in New York City for several years, and I never had a single student who could not decode. They could all decode. Why did I become a curriculum advocate? It's because of that. It's not as if I was blithe about decoding. Obviously, they needed to get to the starting line, but we were getting them to the starting line and no further. And that's why I became interested in knowledge-rich and vocabulary-rich curriculum. But this leads me to a question. You're going to divorce me of another one of my cherished notions. If you've got a national curriculum and it's knowledge-rich, when are we going to see results of that, or am I just barking up the wrong tree?
Well, I think we are seeing the results of that with the pearls and indeed the PISA as well. But these things do take a long time. So we started the whole curriculum review in January 2011, and the primary curriculum didn't become. It was ready for teachers to look at in 2013, and then it was compulsory in 2014, the new test for 2016. But the GCSE reforms really went right up to 2017 before they were finished. So it just takes a lot of time, and we're only in 2024. So I think it will take time. And also the other thing about the whole process is that there's a lot of moving parts in a curriculum. And Tim Oates, who chaired our curriculum review, talked about curriculum coherence, and that means that the documentation is just part of it. You then have the textbooks. What textbooks are they using? We have very low penetration of textbooks in our schools in England, and it's a battle I've been waging with the publishers. They say, well, we can't produce the kind of textbooks you want because the schools won't buy them, and then the schools say, well, we don't want to buy textbooks because they're awful. So, you're in this sort of, no one will make the leap of faith to produce really high quality, knowledge-rich textbooks. So we do have issues to deal with, battles still being waged about knowledge in England.
And I think we're also, national curriculum, I think, needs something different in our minds than it does in your mind. Because I've learned something today, which is I'm assuming that national curriculum means more like everyone's using the same sort of books and lessons and lesson plans, but that's not what it means. It's actually much more akin to standards in the United States. Yeah.
We're trying to do something. Oh, we'll have David.
Microphone for David.
Minister, when you were at Maidstone Grammar School and I was at the Perse in Cambridge, our O levels and A levels were explicit on content. We are now in the middle of culture wars where publishers with the same curriculum have to differentiate them for different parts of the country. No one really agrees any longer on even what content should be. Is that going to be a problem in England as you become ever more multicultural and a more diverse society? Is the core sense of a agreed body of content going to hold?
It's a very good question. It is. I mean, the most controversial area of the curriculum is always history. It shouldn't be, really, because there's a kind of received wisdom of what our nation's history is. There's a book written for children called Our Sceptred Isle, I think, something like that, or Island Story, and it's terribly badly written, and it's critical of every single king and queen we've ever had. So it's not as if it's a sort of jingoistic, nationalistic way of inculcating attitudes in our young people. You can teach history and be quite critical of your own history. But it is very, I mean, I think the culture wars, I've always sought to keep right away from them because I think they are unhelpful. And certainly I'm always very careful that somebody like me who's advocating for, the Willingham Hirsch approach, phonics, all these things, I don't want to be seen to be part of that culture war debate. And I don't think this issue should allow itself to be, hijacked by that. I just think it's important. And you have all your, it's coming to England, all these debates. Like, so much comes from America and ends up in England. I just
Your
think
face when you said that.
I love America. I love it. I do love America. I used to come here all the time on holiday and things. I read the Hirsch book on the beach in South Carolina, and we used to live in Canada. So I love, but because it's such a vibrant nation with, just oozing with ideas, it actually oozes some ideas that are better than others.
That's a good way to put it.
Good. Your future is in diplomacy. Another question from our online audience. Say a little more about, given the evidence, why phonics-based instruction was so opposed by groups like teachers' unions. It's a good question. Why would teachers' unions oppose what is demonstrably working?
It is very interesting why they, I went out of my way to have good relationships with the teacher unions as a minister. And because we were on the same side when it came to teachers' paying conditions. I wanted well-rewarded teachers because I wanted standards to rise. So we're on the same side as that. I never understood why they had a view about the curriculum, because a lot of their members will have different views about the curriculum and phonics and so on. But they did, and they were very opposed. They're very opposed to testing anyway, because they think that puts a lot of pressure on teachers. And they saw the phonics screening check as yet another test, so they were against it for that reason. But also they had a view about, in some of those open letters they wrote to the newspapers, they would say that you should not prescribe a one method of teaching children to read. There are a range of methods, I think they said, to how you teach children to read, and they just stood by that. I never understood why they did. I suspect it was because at that point, the prevailing view amongst the teachers, their members, was that the multi-cueing, the look and say, the whole language approach was the way that most teachers taught reading. And they felt that, but I'm still getting criticism today from the unions about phonics.
But there are still only 44 phonemes. Did the Education Ministry's costs for reading interventions fall after the change in reading curriculum? Did it save money? If I can interpret that question, I guess that means if you're getting 82% of kids decoding, then you're spending less on interventions because the number who are not decoding is falling.
Yes, that must be the case. I'm not sure there's data to show that. Schools are always telling me they don't have enough money. Which I'm sure they're right. We did our best to get as much money as we could into schools. But undoubtedly, you must be spending much less money on remedial teaching if you are getting that decoding right. If you're getting 100% or 90% of your children decoding by the time they're 6. And the aim is for them to be decoding effortlessly. We haven't really mentioned that phrase, but this thing should be effortless by the time that they leave, after they've had 2 years of primary education. And if the vast majority are doing that, whereas we know from the pilot of the phonics screening check, where only 33% reached the standard, we know that 66% until that point were not, and therefore that will lead to more remedial teaching. So inevitably there will, but we don't have data that shows that.
I think one of the big advantages of something like a phonics check, for example, though, is that it can help. We do know that that children's reading problems can be complex, and decoding issues can be very much based in other kinds of sort of language differences and language difficulties. And so one of the good things about something like a phonics check is it should be helping to identify kids who have those problems, right? So kids who may be able to learn to decode. I've been tutoring some kids and I'm seeing this, firsthand. Kids who can be taught to decode pretty well, but they really have a lot of language comprehension issues. They're just it's not just vocabulary, but just sort of their ability to construct a good sentence, a grammatically correct sentence, a full sentence. They just need a lot of work on that. And teaching them to decode is giving them a very good tool to access to books and being able to sort of teach themselves through reading. But at those early ages, I think the difficulties with kids decoding can have multiple sources, and systematic synthetic phonics is not the only. It's like some kids are going to need more than that, I think. Are you finding that at your school, for example?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Minister, I asked you earlier about using policy levers to change practice. The implication was for the good. How do you feel about using policy levers to eliminate bad practice? We were speaking about this earlier before we started. In at least, 3 states, I think, Emily, now, they are looking to ban 3 queuing.
More.
More than,
Several
okay.
more than that, about 9 or 10, yeah.
Is there a role for policy in stopping teachers from doing things that we know do not work?
It's not a lever I've ever sought to use. We don't ban people from using whole language or multiple cueing approaches to teaching reading. We are expecting that the training and the accountability regime will prevent them from doing that. But 17,000 schools, 300,000 primary school teachers, that I don't know what happens in every single classroom in the country. And I suspect there are some teachers who are using old methods, which is why it's 82% and not 100% in the phonics screening check. But I was just trying to think in any policy area, have we outlawed approaches?
Thou shalt not.
Yes, I don't think we ever have. I mean, I was worried about our numeracy strategy, that there's some most peculiar methods have crept in to how you do long multiplication, long division, called the chunking method in long division and the grid method in long multiplication, which is the most absurd way of doing those algorithms. And we didn't sort of ban those approaches. We just brought in a curriculum that made it very clear that the efficient written methods of multiplication is this, and we did not include the grid method or the other methods that we know don't work. But I don't think we wouldn't actually ban the things. But there's a different. I know that's happening in some state laws in this country.
Well, we are just about at time, so I want to thank Emily Hanford and Nick Gibb. And we will see you back here in 10 or 15 years to see if we've caught up. Thank you very much. Thank you.